Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining this session today on emerging futures for tokenized licensing in the creative industries. My name's John Colomos, and I'm the director of DECaDE, the Centre for the Decentralized Digital Economy, and that is the centre that has put on the webinar today. I just want to open by just introducing the centre and what it is we do. DECaDE, as I say, is the Centre for the Decentralized Digital Economy. It's a bit of a mouthful. What do we mean by a decentralized digital economy? Well, it is the peer-to-peer or gig economy we all live in today, where anyone can be a producer or consumer of digital goods or services online. So, for example, I could drive an Uber or take an Uber or go stay in a flat in an Airbnb or maybe rent out my flat. These sorts of peer-to-peer interactions commonly take place on centralized platforms. And what DECaDE is doing is exploring what decentralized platforms could offer this future digital economy in terms of perhaps more inclusive, fairer governance and new ways to create value, particularly pertinent today when we talk about licensing of content in a decentralized creative economy. So what we're looking at today really is the question of content supply chain. And that really is what DECaDE is all about. It's all about digital supply chains and how we can reduce friction and create value through them. We are very interested in DECaDE about provenance technologies and using data-centric technologies like distributed ledgers and AI in order to deliver on these decentralized platforms. Provenance technologies have emerged as quite a common solution now to help us determine the authenticity of content and fight fake news and misinformation online. But actually, once we have established provenance through all manner of technical solutions, be it watermarking, fingerprinting, metadata, you'll see those there as the pillars at the bottom of our diagram there on the right. Then we can start saying something about its authenticity, its ownership, and ultimately, therefore, increasing its value. And then that opens the door to perhaps being able to monetize that content and license it in new ways through, for example, decentralized marketplaces. So, for example, with strong provenance technologies supporting authentic content, we can do things like establish consent over whether people allow the use of their data for, let's say, training AI models, which is quite a topical thing in the UK at the moment with the copyright and AI consultation. But also provenance attached to content can help us describe its origins as being synthetic, and that can help us with issues like AI labeling and AI transparency. And perhaps most excitingly, as I say, we can look at new ways to create value from content in terms of recognizing and rewarding the contributors of content as it's reused or remixed online. And again, that pertains to the use of generative AI, but it could be to any use of content online. So yeah, I'm going to hand over now to Chris Elsden, who is at the Institute for Design Informatics at Edinburgh, who are another part of DECaDE. And Chris is going to be sharing his introduction about some of the work we've been doing in DECaDE in this space, and we'll be chairing the session today. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, John. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. I also want to thank Digital Catapult for hosting us and for support of a lot of the work that you're going to see today. I'm Dr. Chris Elsden. I'm a Chancellor's Fellow in Cyber Design at the Institute for Design Informatics and one of a number of academics that work on the DECaDE Centre that John's just briefly introduced. And John gave us there the kind of the context technologically in which we've been doing a quite specific piece of research and looking into particularly this topic around tokenized licensing. And so what we're going to do is a bit of an agenda. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the report and the work that we've been doing in the last year based on some of the technologies that John mentioned. But then most of the session is going to be a panel. We've got 4 excellent panelists, 2 of which have worked very closely with me on this on DECaDE, and 2 external panelists who bring some really strong views on the space in the creative industries and in tokenized licensing. So we'll have about 35-40 minutes for the panel, and we'll have a chance for a good 15 or 20 minutes for questions at the end. So I hope this is something that's of interest to many of you, and I hope we can get a good discussion going. I'll also say we've got a number of links and papers. There's also a report that this is building on that is published on the Digital Catapult website. We'll put all of those links in the chat shortly. So there'll be lots of things that you can refer to afterwards. And what we hope to do is give you an introduction to this space. To do that, I'm going to just share one slide, which is to introduce this thing called the Aura framework. And this is an example of tokenized licensing. I don't expect you to understand everything or follow everything on this slide just now, but it might give you a little bit of a sense as to what's interesting in this space and what this report's about. So Aura is a technical protocol. It's been developed by John and Cara Balan, who are both based at the University of Surrey, and has been part of Cara's doctoral research. It's an example of media tokenization and tokenized licensing. And just some of the key features that I want to identify and that are quite interesting about this framework is that it separates, compared to traditional NFTs and sort of other forms of media tokenization, where the rights and ownership would be bound together in a single token that you might transfer to someone. Here, this model separates ownership and rights into two different kinds of non-fungible tokens. And the creator, the person that made that work, doesn't simply hold one token to prove ownership, but in fact manages a rights contract. And one thing that's really interesting to us is this idea that you can use that contract to define all manner of machine readable licenses. And actually, we could be much more creative and bespoke in how we sort of bundle and unbundle different sets of rights together. And then a licensee can come along and take some of those licenses or tokens off the shelf to reuse the work without necessarily needing a lot of the other traditional infrastructure that you might need around rights management. And then the other key piece of this that's really essential, and John spoke to there, is this is combined with a standard for media authenticity, C2PA. And so what that ensures is that provenance about the media and things about how it was made and where it originated from all remains connected with that media, however it's transformed. So at Edinburgh, we are an Institute for Design Informatics. We're a team of designers and researchers. And what we're really interested in is getting these really technical, complicated things in front of people who work with these technologies, people who are members of the general public. And so we've been developing engaging workshops and prototypes with which we can actually demonstrate and show people what this technology does and explore it and critique it and understand what its implications, what its strengths, what its weaknesses might be. And the work that we've been doing is based primarily on a workshop that we ran with the support of Digital Capital last year and a range of industry partners, and hopefully some of you are back in the room this afternoon. That's led to the report that goes along with this work, as well as a number of academic papers. Francis Liddell, who will be on the panel very shortly, has been leading this work for us and has also conducted a range of interviews around it. So I'm looking at this in the context of lots of different parts of the creative and cultural industry, because you might imagine what this means if you work in music or in illustration or animation or in the museum sector really varies very widely. I should also say the demo that we used for this work is also still live, and we'll post that in the chat in a minute, so you can have a look at yourself and see how Aura works. And again, we're academics. We're using this, not simply proposing this as a solution to solve all of the problems and challenges of licensing and management, but as a technology probe, as a way to understand what the kind of challenges are that the creative and cultural industries face as they seek to try and manage the ownership and rights of their work in a digital economy, and particularly inquiring about the value of decentralization and tokenization in doing that. In the report, we do identify a series of potential 9 use cases. We're not going to be able to cover them all today, but we're going to hopefully have a very interesting conversation about some of what we see the key qualities and opportunities for this. So I'm going to stop sharing just now, and I'm going to introduce our panel. So maybe I'll invite people to turn the cameras on, and then I can give people a brief introduction, and we can get going. Great. Okay. So we're very fortunate to be joined by with part of the DECaDE team. We have sort of Dr. Frances Middle. So Frances works very closely with myself. She's a postdoctoral research associate in design informatics. Her background is in arts management and museum studies, and she's been looking at applying blockchain technologies in museum practice in the creative industries more widely for a number of years now, and it's really led on this work from our perspective at Edinburgh. We're also joined by Cara Balan, and Cara, as I say, is sort of very much the originator of this framework, and is the one to point all the technical questions to. And actually he's been doing a range of really interesting work as well in the generative AI space and considering complex issues around copyright, privacy, and attribution. And we're delighted also to have two external panelists. So first of all, David Oxley, who's a UK-based creative technologist. He founded Numeric Limited and been exploring creative technology across a range of different projects focused on AI, WebXR, generative art, and immersive storytelling. He's also been involved, I know, in a number of other projects at the University of Edinburgh as well. So there's lots of other bits and pieces that David's doing that are really interesting in this space as well. And Yayoi Shinori is the VP of External Affairs and a General Counsel at Powerhouse Arts, so she's bringing a legal angle to this. She also serves in the US alliance partner to City Lights Law, a Japanese law firm representing creators, and as a board director to Startban, a Japanese blockchain company. So we've got on our panel a great combination of technical software expertise, understanding the cultural sector, legal expertise, and people, creative technologists working with us from a creative and artist perspective. So welcome all. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to start with a sort of general question about this sort of emerging space around tokenized licensing. So, and maybe Francis, will start with you. So how has this space developed in the past two to 3 years, and so particularly following the kind of boom and bust of NFTs in 2021, and why is this a significant space now for the creative and cultural industries in 2025?
Yeah, what a question to start off with. Well, yeah, it's certainly been a really interesting landscape. As Chris mentioned, my background is really in kind of the museum and arts management space. And what museums care about, of course, is provenance and authentication. And at the very core of all the interest around blockchains since 2016, 2017 has been this authentication element and the way that distributed ledger technologies could be a way to bring stronger senses of transparency and provenance where it's needed most. And we've seen that in lots of different examples. One example I always refer back to is the Christie's collaboration with Artery in 2018 with the Epsworth collection. But, you know, examples like that really demonstrate that there is an appetite for this. But the problem is that, you know, the technology has, you know, it keeps evolving. And I think to kind of fast forward to today with token licensing, I think what tokenized licensing really offers compared to those previous examples, and particularly Aura as well, is this ability to create much more nuanced and granular understandings of provenance data. So to take Aura as one example, this idea that you can suddenly bring CTPA with token licensing actually means that you can start to track not only ownership provenance, which is also really important, but actually creation provenance as well. So how things then are changed and edited over time. So that's the thing that I'm most excited about within this space.
Great, thanks, Francis. I wonder maybe, Carl, we'll jump to you with a kind of technical piece, and then we can kind of spread it out, thinking about the implications of that legally and in creative terms. So, Carl, yeah, perhaps you want to say a little bit about where Aura came from for you, and also, yeah, I'd be interested as you know, this is something you worked on almost 2 years ago now as well. So, what else do you see now in this space, and why is it significant in 2025?
So indeed, the space has changed a lot over the past few years. Aura initially came from the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is the initiative driving C2PA. And that's obviously super important because there's all this pressure that's coming from the rapid advancements in AI, but we can't really do anything until we have the technology to do it. And we do have the technology to do it, but we also need the standards. And so that's a really important part there. And from me, as a PhD student, I've been a PhD student for 3 years. So I used to go to conferences, I remember 2-3 years ago, and I would talk about the work that we're doing and why it's important. And people were definitely curious, but no one else was doing this. And from my perspective, it's been a complete 180 to the interest that we're seeing today, and all the commercial, you know, startups and companies that are doing it, all the open standards that we're seeing develop. So it's really great.
Great, thanks, Cara. So from a creative perspective then, David, what do you see as the kind of opportunity or the aspiration of what tokenized licensing potentially do for you, or you hope it might be?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'd entered the NFT art space in 2021, and one of the things that seemed fairly obvious to me is that there wasn't an ability to really kind of specify rights and licensing, except maybe to put it in the description field of the NFT. So definitely by having this dual token model and being able to specify rights separately and in a machine readable way just makes perfect sense to me. It's good to kind of finally see this as a potential opportunity here. Yeah.
Yeah, and then so then legally, Yayoi, do you want to say a bit about where this sort of sits and where what kind of might be distinctive about where we maybe were with this 3 or 4 years ago and where we might be now?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you so much again for having me today. And again, sort of, I'm wearing multiple hats here. I think I'm wearing both sort of a legal, US legal IP framework hat, mainly in copyright, but also in the developing field of AI, but also sort of speaking from my practitioner background in the contemporary art world. And as Dr. Francis very well knows, I think the contemporary art world looked at the 2021 NFT bubble and the 2022 bubble burst, and there's a little bit of schadenfreude, I think, for most contemporary art people, where they said, "Oh, aren't we very glad that we stayed away?" And so, unfortunately, what I'm currently seeing is while all of you all are doing incredible work, like Carr and Dr. Francis, you all are putting together this wonderful Aura framework. I still have to remind myself that a lot of contemporary art people might still need a little bit more to connect the dots as to why tokenized licensing is different from NFTs, and the way that the digital art NFT bubble happened is still different yet from the initial types of licensing models that David was talking about. Also, in some ways, the technology has moved far ahead, and the humans who are going to be utilizing this technology may not necessarily have been improving their education about the situation. And I would just also say, very interestingly enough, smart contracts, we all said were not necessarily smart. But we also need to remember that machine readability licenses still need to be understood by humans also. So while there is this wonderful opportunity for very nuanced licensing, I think there's a little bit of education that still needs to happen too.
Great, great. So we're gonna a couple of things. So that's a great introduction to, I guess, where we're all coming from as well. Something I forgot to mention at the start is that we really do want lots of questions from you. But the way to do that is through the Zoom Q&A. So I'm not able to see the chat with everyone just now. But if you put the questions in the Q&A, then we will get to them, and I'll keep an eye on them. I'll try and bring them in where they're relevant. And then we'll make space for more than then. So if you've got questions already, by all means drop them in there, and we'll get to them. And they might be something we can answer very quickly, or they might be a much longer ranging discussion. Just picking up on where we were there, we're going to talk about 3 particular use cases that we identified in the report. One of those is around enabling new kinds of economic interactions between stakeholders, and sort of thinking particularly around things like royalties. The second is just what you were talking about there, about what it means to start trying to automate aspects of copyright and licensing, and what it means for that to become machine readable. And then the third is about how is it that what's the value of having these more nuanced, bespoke forms of licensing that might start to reflect personal, social, cultural values that exist. So we're going to try and go through each of those use cases. I guess starting with the economic case first. There's something significant that John brought up about thinking about this as a supply chain, and an image or a piece of media might go through multiple parts of a supply chain before it reaches an end user in some ways. So I wonder if perhaps, David, you want to talk a bit about what that supply chain means to you as a creative, and sort of the ways in which your work gets remixed and where it gets taken, and the sort of things you want to do to try and control it or manage it, and ultimately where you get value from
So yeah, since 2021, I've been able to remix some other artists' work as kind of challenges, and lots of people kind of get involved and do that. And then quite often we get the opportunity to then publish those as our own works and give attribution. Um, and I would really like the ability to then have that kind of trail there, so that those works that are published can then, refer back to the original work that was presented as the challenge for that.
And Francis, sort of in the conversations you've been having, you want to say a bit about the kind of some of the challenges or complications when it comes to thinking about things like royalties, or how do you, let's say someone remixes a piece of work and it goes viral and it generates a lot of value. What are the challenges about actually distributing that across a supply chain, given all the different contributions people might have made before that work finally went on to be valuable?
Yeah, I mean, it's so complex, right? But I think the reality of that is, first of all, the problems with tokenized licensing and automating these elements is generally that it makes assumptions that everyone wants to be recognized and that we want this trackability, like that is something that is universal, which certainly from the research and the interviews I did, like that's not necessarily the case. And we do need to be thinking carefully about what copyright really means for different creatives across that supply chain, and how that then is recognized. And we could go into the resale discussion, but maybe I could leave that to you as the expert in legal. But there's certainly some interesting discussion there about, particularly with tokenized licensing or generally about how it brings a new addition to something like resale rights. So say, resale rights, just to explain, is the idea that when you purchase something and then you sell it on in a secondary market, that artist can retain a certain level of equity within that work to receive an income. So normally it's about 10%. It's not something that's recognized across every country, and not everyone is for resale rights as well. There are artists. I remember speaking with one actually in a conference that and I were at in November last year, where we had this large debate of actually it may actually it kind of enforces artists to work in a certain way. It actually affects the primary market. So there's a lot of implications to creating economic interactions where, whilst initially or superficially you might assume this is a good thing, right? Artists want to be paid. But actually there's far more of a kind of deeper issue underneath that.
Yeah. Do you want to take that on a bit, Yoi?
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that. And I think one of the hopes and dreams that I think many digital art NFT artists had, and I don't obviously want to speak for David, of course, but for the artists that I got to work with in 2021 and beyond, was that issuing digital art on the blockchain would allow for rails to take place, where if a work exchanged hands from the artist on primary market to an initial collector, and then onwards from that first collector onwards, there will be an automation of this concept of royalties. And as Francis pointed out, royalty rights are unfortunately not codified legally in many jurisdictions. In fact, they have been tried to be codified and they did not work. For example, in California, it didn't work. In the EU, there is a licensing scheme that does not always work. And so it felt almost like the NFT world would allow all of a sudden for artists to be able to capitalize on the increase or valuation of the work as it continued to exchange hands. And that seemed to be a very beautiful concept. And I still believe in that, even though some artists don't necessarily want that to be the main reasoning for why they sell work. At the end of the day, all of us arts workers work in the art world because we love to see creation happen. And we love to see artists make work, and we would ideally love for them to be able to make a living off of the beautiful work that they do. But for whatever reason, sort of the NFT market didn't quite do that. There were lots of technical reasons why that didn't. For example, interoperability reasons amongst platforms, collectors taking transactions off chain, so they then exchange the NFT between their own wallets without going through the platform. And then platforms themselves saying, hey, we're going to actually switch our policies about automated royalties and having people the ability to opt out of those things. And so that kind of came and went. And I think it'll be interesting to see now with things like the Aura framework, where in fact now for Aura framework, as I understand it, we're separating ownership and rights. And so there is still that agency that's left for the artist to be able to move those things and to keep those levers in check. That might be sort of an interesting way to see how artists can retain that agency, both when it comes to ownership and giving away or selling that work, and then setting forth the licensing to the underlying IP.
Do you want to respond to that, David?
Yeah, I mean, where I'm coming from is there's so many works that have been published onto the blockchain already, and the ability to, if Aura could have, if the dual token model was able to attach license tokens to that past work, then there might be an opportunity for artists who are already active and have works on there to then define licenses, which could really kind of, work out pretty well, I think.
And I wonder, I mean, there's two things. I mean, I guess technically I wanted to throw that to Cara and sort of think about, there's something that I think has always been very curious with any sort of DLT project or application, of this sense of having to really be able to define things very clearly at the start of something, like what you want that contract to do or what that token is for. And it's always felt to me like there's this real tension between, we know that life's quite messy and things change, and actually for example, your motivations as an artist, whether you want to generate royalties or money from a work, might change over time. I wonder if you could speak, Cara, a bit to sort of like technically the ways in which we can enable this flexibility, or the ways in which, sort of as David's suggesting, is it possible to go back and add licenses to these things, or how it might become a more dynamic model rather than just scraping something into stone at the start?
In Aura, it is possible because, as you saw in the diagram in the beginning, each artist has their own rights contract, and then the rights contract actually owns the NFTs. So what you need to do is you take those NFTs, you put them under the ownership of the rights contract, and then it functions as you want it to function. But I actually wanted to jump into Yayo's point about downstream royalties. The reason why Aura can work that way and it can honor those downstream royalties is because it is and remains decentralized, right? So NFTs and blockchains, they are decentralized technologies inherently, but these NFTs, they are actually being sold on centralized platforms. So all the big marketplaces, they're all centralized, and they had the power to choose whether they wanted to honor the downstream royalties or not, and they chose overwhelmingly not to. So, yeah.
And could I just pick up on sort of moving that forward as well, and this I've been linking into some of the machine readability stuff. Obviously one of the big debates at the moment is about how artists might be compensated or receive royalties when AI models are benefiting or scraping or using sort of these works. I know that's an area you've been working in a lot lately as well. Do you want to speak to a bit sort of where you see the opportunities for tokenized licensing to support or even protect artists as they interact with AI?
So we've actually already implemented this in multiple ways. So what you can do is you can use C2PA to encode every single training path that has gone into training an AI model into its downstream provenance. So then you can use a whole host of techniques to identify which assets are closest to a generated asset, right? So which training data is closest to a generated asset. And that can be based on style or on content, and that can be simply based on how it looks, or it can be sort of predefined simply by embedding certain signals into the training data and seeing which of those signals have been transferred to the generated image. And that's done via watermarking. And then once you've done that, if all of these images or whatever types of assets they come with provenance themselves, then you can identify who exactly has created that. You can see what their license says. You can easily pay them through their rights contract. So there's lots you can do if you want to.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I'm wondering, Francis, maybe I'll come to you then. So we move into this thinking about the machine readability and the kind of automated nature of this. And I don't want to forget your point earlier from Yaya about they have to be human, machine readable has to be human readable. I think that's really fascinating. So let's come back to that as well. But Francis, do you want to say a bit about what came out of the initial research is this being a valuable use case and the challenges around it as well.
Yeah, so this came through like a number of different ways, but I think kind of largely kind of derived from my conversations with people based with who have or hold or should I say like are stewards of large collections, so cultural institutions or sort of media repositories, and really talking about the challenges they face around license logics and this need to kind of find a way to enable the sharing and distribution of those collections when those collections may have knotty copyright, shall we say, and thinking about could things like smart contracts help to automate not necessarily all of it, but certainly aspects of it. And there's other elements as well that we discussed around kind of things like safe dates and other kinds of like semi-automated approaches already used, and thinking about actually could things like the Aura framework or tokenized licensing generally be quite an interesting way just to sort of fully automate that to support that in terms of resources. The other point as well, perhaps to mention here is again, yeah, in terms of like other knotty copyright is things like orphan works and the kind of large challenges that particularly institutions face around that of these works where the copyright holder is unknown. And certainly from a UK perspective, the process in which to apply for licensing via the UK government is quite a lengthy process, takes a long, sort of a lot of resources to do, and requires due diligence. And there has been lots of research in the past about how you could you use blockchain to record those processes. And again, the Aura framework could be a way to help kind of enable the distribution of those works, whilst also being able to, you know, if say the copyright holder appears, to be able to revoke those because you're tracking it and be able to work out how it's being reused specifically. So those were a couple of things that came out from our research.
David, I know you've got more skepticism or more concerns maybe around sort of some challenges of automated licensing. Do you want to sort of express a few of those?
Well, I think, yeah, back when I was working in the music industry, like taking kind of MP3 player devices and delivering music online, there was a lot of effort to do digital rights management, and some of it wasn't really that successful. For example, I think Microsoft had a DRM tech for their audio for their music. We used it for some online music distribution, but then it was discontinued. So a lot of customers couldn't actually use their music when they upgraded to a new computer. So that's my concern over digital rights management enforcement. But being able to identify rights, I think I'm all for it. You know, being able to easily like look at rights and licensing and so on, definitely I'm for that. But it has to be very flexible as well. I think that's quite important, but also I guess easy for people to use. So like an artist who's going to publish a piece of art, maybe to have some kind of simple option with some default set, like, you know, and like an option that you can opt in to having your artwork used for AI, for example, rather than opt out. So yeah, still quite wary that it goes down the route of trying to enforce it rather than being able to easily identify it.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there, isn't there? There's, as you say, there's this distinction between it being used as a way to discover or bring visibility to what a work is and what it's related to and where it's come from. And then there's a sort of concern. And I think a lot of blockchain work sort of straddles this path well, but everything becoming very much sort of set in stone and very, yes, a whole set of consequences for that you can't get out of. There's not flexibility from. And then also, yeah, this sort of sense of how you sort of manage that over time as well. I wonder if you want to speak a bit to, I guess, yeah, this sort of notion of automated rights management, and I guess particularly sort of legally, you know, where does that leave us and how well that works?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I wish I had the answer to that question, but sort of like spitballing it out a little bit. I think there's actually also a distinction slightly between what Francis was talking about and David was talking about, and maybe Aura can in fact provide a solution for that. So I think in the cultural sector, there's both issues of copyright management, so ensuring that the artist who retains the underlying copyright of a work that is not yet in the public domain has the right to capitalize from the reproduction and dissemination of the imagery of that work, if the artist so chooses. So there's like a whole underlying IP commercialization, monetization part that is one aspect of licensing. The other aspect, I think, of cultural stewardship and preservation is actually about physical moves management. It's about understanding where the artwork is, who is the artist, and then if, for example, if the artwork moves and it exchanges hands, whether as a loan from one museum to another museum in an exhibition, or through secondary, through maybe an auction, it goes from a collector to another collector, it's tracking that information, which also adds to the provenance as well. So I think there's actually two separate things that we're talking about, and potentially the separation of ownership and rights in the OR framework can in fact help to solve for that as a tech layer. However, the largest, I think, question becomes the oracle problem, though. At the end of the day, what is being recorded on the wonderful oral framework? Is that accurate? Are people going to be able to track that information and then fix it if it is inaccurate? So I think there's a little bit of a sort of a manualized process that is still needed to make sure that the framework has accurate information on it.
And can I come back, because that's like David, you were talking about making that easy for artists to do as well. And I'm curious, and then maybe Cara, you can speak to this sort of within Photoshop, right? There's when you go to save a file, there are ways for you to sort of recognize some of this. Do you want to say a bit about ways in which we can sort of, I suppose, have more faith in this process, but also make it clear for artists about how they might articulate some of these rights, right? And I guess we're saying on the one hand, hey, we've got this great opportunity to make all these incredibly bespoke licenses, but actually that's probably still really complicated for an artist to understand all the implications of it. So I wonder if you could just say a bit, Cara, about how we, technically how we can make that easier for people.
Well, we have worked for Aura. We have developed a front end that I thought was quite easy to use, and I hope people will go and try to have a play around with it. But it's indeed in Photoshop, for example. So because Adobe is part of the Content Authenticity Initiative, they've put this C2PA, this provenance standard into most of their products, if not all. And that means when you sign, well, not necessarily sign, when you export an image from Photoshop, you can also set, your provenance information. You can set your authorship. You can put your blockchain address, your website, and when you sign that image with that information, you do that with your own personal cryptographic keys that are only yours. And that's one way that we embed sort of identity and reputation into the system. But also, not to delay the conversation, but I think I made a very good point about where a piece of art is and where it's exhibited, or which collector has it in their collection. This is all part of the provenance information, but it's also part of its reputation. And that's something that we are looking into, and we've got a recent paper that we've published. It's called Content Arcs, also stands for Authenticity, Rights, and Compensation, where we show all these different decentralized technologies and how they fit together. And one of them is identity and reputation, because that's also part of what gives people trust and what makes an artwork more valuable. But yes, it's easy. We can make we can make things easy for people who aren't used to these technologies. But we should be teaching them about these technologies, and they are certainly very, very open and excited and motivated to learn and hear about it. We do indeed just need to make it a little bit more accessible.
Do you want to just speak to that a bit, Francis? Well, and again, I think it's sort of beyond just the kind of accessibility and managing of wallets and all this sort of stuff. Just the challenges that you see artists and creators having sort of thinking through these license logics and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is so difficult to attempt to what is essentially quantifying behaviors and knowing what you want to say, and then knowing how to put that into a particular way of saying it that's not necessarily how you would speak it in real world if you were saying, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do that. And that's definitely something that I found was a challenge with some of the interviews that I did with various cultural professionals. It was this idea of like, well, you know, it's such a loaded question to be like, hey, this creates bespoke licensing, but what would you like? It's more than thinking about, actually, let's think about what if this happened? Okay, then maybe we'd have something like this and that, and sort of really like breaking it down. In the same way of with a lot of these technologies or these kind of complex ideas, it's really just breaking it down into those manageable chunks for people to really get their head around, so that then they can start to critique it, right? And I think that's, you know, to go back to the origin demo as kind of, that's a good example of using that with Aura. But in terms of licensing, I think it's still, yeah, I think we've still got a way to go there in terms of really understanding how you channel that and push that through. Yeah, I don't know whether Gary has any thoughts on that.
What do you think that becomes like? Is that about coming up with templates that people reuse, or what's the kind of intermediary step between that? I don't know.
Yeah, I think like this is the thing that I keep kind of thinking back on, and you know, you could go back to the way that NFTs were, right? Like people, most NFT artists are not making smart contracts themselves. And that's how we got into the issues around the resales being taken away from people because they realized they did not fully own the contract. They were using proxies. So they didn't have the real control. But places like Manifold and a few other like sort of platforms are enabling people to have that through templates. And maybe this is the way forward, is helping to bring a stronger understanding of kind of what is it that I need. But rather than saying this is the framework, perhaps it's being like, these are the questions I need to ask myself in order to get there.
Yeah. We've got some questions coming in, and one of them is quite a good way for us to move on to the next part, which is about kind of how we express sort of personal or social or cultural values. We've got a question from Andrew Larkham, which is, is there any significant difference in preferences on tokenization between different creative sectors? For example, were game designers more enthusiastic than musicians? And again, Francis, maybe you should answer that one first, but I'll open it out to others as well. To sort of, I think that's something we realize. We talk about the creative industries, but it's so diverse in terms of the media, the practices, the traditions, and that's, you know, not considering sort of different international contexts and things as well. But do you want to speak to that first, Francis, like any sort of particular differences you saw between sectors?
Yeah, definitely. I think something from like the animation industry that I found really fascinating was the way sort of some participants spoke about there being these kind of unwritten rules about how you share and reuse work. And I expect that's something that is sort of cuts across many of the creative industry fields. But I thought that was very interesting in thinking about, well, what if that was made visible with licensing? What would be the actual implication of that by stating something that is normally not stated at all? I think it's quite an interesting idea. And then speaking from a cultural perspective, I mean, there's so much work being done within the museum space around indigenous data sovereignty, and the way in which we should be thinking about copyright with cultural values in mind. And there's been a lot of work around indigenous communities and working directly with them and thinking about when you're digitizing content with them, we should be thinking about licenses that only enable people to share and see that content based on the cultural values that that work represents. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about this idea of sharing and reuse and sort of tokenized licensing generally, and the way that it can actually extend the work that's been done already. That isn't necessarily just about kind of like assuming everyone wants to have access and assuming everything should be shared. So there's just a couple of examples for you.
Thanks, yeah. And David, you sort of mentioned your music background before as well. Do you want to sort of speak to sort of differences you see in practices or traditions of expectations in regards to sort of tokenization and licensing across different fields?
Yeah, I remember speaking with someone who's doing kind of blockchain music, a kind of music label, and they were still quite keen to really kind of protect the music, and there's not really any real solution to kind of protect the music, so it's only available after play using just blockchain technology. But I am seeing a few other endeavors to do music on the blockchain. As looking at the game side, I also worked on a game last year which has some connection to the blockchain, but again, there's a lot of resistance in that sector. But the way I used it last year for the game was that there was characters that you could buy. and once you bought them, they're available in the game. It was a really, really lightweight integration that we did, but I can see that being quite useful, and maybe even people being able to remix those characters would be a great feature and would make use of Aura, for example.
Yeah, and I suppose I mean I think the gaming is a particularly interesting example because it's so natively digital, right? So there's maybe more opportunity to track or understand the use thereof of certain things that people have remixed, right, and how they've become valuable or picked up by others in a certain platform or context. To come on to this sort of broader question around more what the kinds of conditions that creators might care about or wish to set around the work that are not considered in current legal standards. So even if we take something like Creative Commons, we've got a set of standard licenses which are obviously have been very successful in enabling people to express some of the kind of general expectations around how that work should be used. But yeah, what are the kinds of things that people wish they could be saying? What are the kinds of things that maybe are more nuanced or more individual, where people wish they had a bit more control, or could express something more personal or sort of culturally situated in regards to the artworks? Anyone's welcome to come in on that one. I don't know, Francis, if there's other examples. Oh, yeah, you and go.
Yeah. You go.
Maybe I'll try to begin to answer some of those things. Francis gave some wonderful examples of how there are different cultural standards by which people share within different cultures. And I think that and I know that many, shall we say, Western traditional copyright frameworks have a lot to learn from these other kinds of cultures. And I know that, for example, in Australia, one of my dear expert friends is doing, who's a copyright expert, who's also doing a lot of research in that arena, sort of talking to the Indigenous community to learn more about how those cultural values can then be reflected into the current copyright framework. And I think it is true, especially in contemporary art, I think, that the copyright framework does not always capture adequately the art historical context of what artists do. For example, appropriation art can easily be considered a copyright infringement under the US laws. And a lot of times the US courts have to decide fact specifically whether or not appropriation artists can have the benefit of what is called fair use under the US copyright rules. And so one of the things, while I am a lawyer, one of the things that I am very interested in is this, what I consider extra legal. So outside of the current copyright framework as it exists, if somebody has the intention to do a different form of licensing, do they have the agency, the ability, and show the intent to be able to say, actually, I believe that I'm taking myself out of copyright, whether that is Creative Commons, which, as Chris mentioned, is already in some ways a wonderful standard and an alternative to copyright, or something else that is much more bespoke and then gets encoded on the Aura framework.
Yeah. Do you want to speak a bit to that one as well, Francis?
Yeah, I mean, it also reminded me of kind of other kinds of licensing mechanisms that have been explored within the blockchain ecosystem. And one